Do you find it difficult to know what to paint, or need some inspirational painting ideas? Do you have a dashcam? If so, it could be a great way of giving you some ideas for painting subjects based on your travels. Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot, and in this video I want to cover some tips for painting from images from your dashcam. Now, just before I go on through this video, it's free to watch but not free to produce. If you do like these videos, please consider supporting me via Patreon at www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Every month or so, up on there on Patreon, I set a painting project for my members, and for a small pledge, very small pledge, I give you a personal critique, normally a video critique in return, with some extra hints and tips for you. So for more details, please go up to my Patreon site, and you'll find the links in the description of this video below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get automatic notification of new videos. So this is me traveling through France, and with my dashcam you can access all the video segments of a journey as separate files, and you can download those to PC or view them back on the dashcam. Now, for most of the footage, in my opinion, it would be quite boring. As you've seen with some of these scenes, this particular landscape quite flat, and well, there's a bend, more interesting bend coming up here. Look at the light car with the dark background. So there's some scenes which could make for a painting subject, but on the whole, it's going to be quite boring. So you've got to be prepared to scroll forwards, go fast forwards to find those real gems. By the way, I do set my dashcam to record at a low resolution, as indeed I would do if I was taking some photos with my smartphone. Setting it to a low resolution, you don't want any detail. I just want to see a simple image and just to get to see the main shapes. And if there was too much detail, then the danger is you just get bogged down and you see lots of little finicky details, and you just feel that you've got to paint them all in. I mean, what we've got to try and remember is we're trying to create a piece of art here. We're not particularly in a loose painting style, we're not trying to replicate a scene exactly. So if I can, well, in fact, if I just stop here, I mean, that could be quite a nice scene here with the this lighthouse. Look how dark the sky is. What I look for, particularly on a sunny day, are big areas of contrast, big areas of tonal values. So actually, if I just go forwards a little bit more, there. So look how blue the shadow is on that house, and how dark the shadow is going across the grass verge and the road. So yeah, looking for some inspiration like that, and compositional things. That tree, this palm tree, is looking quite nice bit of dark shadows below the canopy of that tree as well. Anyway, so we go on and on and on. I might just skip through, because I have identified a little village that we go through towards the end here, and it's coming up very shortly. In fact, here we are, we're just coming into the village now. And if I stop at certain places and try and identify potential painting subjects, so this could be one. Again, going back to what I said earlier, trying to have a scene with lots of light against a dark background, or dark against a light background. Well, you've got one there. You've got this parking sign, brightly lit against a very dark wall there, and again, a cool shadows on the back of that building. In the distance, we've got some background buildings, and on the right hand side we've got a bit of a curve of the hedgerow there. Just go on a little bit further, Stop there. These are quite nice. This speed ramp here, this raised bit with these little white triangles. That's quite a nice feature. I mean, I often use pedestrian crossings, but that's just as good. Having these white triangles, maybe a bit tricky to draw with the perspective, trying to get that right. But again, we've got some nice architectural things on the left hand side, and these curved trees going over the road. So we go on a little bit more, bit further into, we're coming into the village proper now, and here's another scene about there, or about there. So big shadow going across the road from the tree, shade on the right hand side of this building, and a nice vehicle, a light coloured vehicle connected to that shadow there, and look how nice these shadows are, and that little lamp brightly lit against the darkness under the eaves of that roof there. So let's go on. So I'm going to be doing a video somewhere around here, is my chosen spot, but if I actually go a little bit further into the village and stop there, so just about to turn around a left hand corner here, a sharp left hand bend, and look at this monument. Again, I mean, this gives us a nice foreground, the pedestrian crossing partly in the shade, brightly lit on the right hand side, got a bit of middle ground interest with the monument, and then background, the row of buildings, bit of shadow under the canopy, some vehicles, well, dark shadow going down. There's a little sort of road here leading off to the right, dark shadow off to the right there. Oh, and a few nice signs on the front of that building. So let's just go on through, see if there's anything else that grabs our fancy. Turn around that left hand bend, and let's stop there. So now we've got on the right hand side a church steeple, that church tower. On the left hand side, this big building casting a longer shadow right across the road there. So the light's coming directly probably from the left hand side now. So that's quite nice. A bit similar to the last one. Bit of foreground interest. I think we'd have to imagine a car in there, or some people in that scene, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Go on a little bit further, and right, so this one now, complete shadow across the foreground, brightly lit middle ground, and some distant buildings in the background. This road is going to go on down to that this next crossing there, that next pedestrian crossing, and it's going to veer around to the right, and then the sun is going to be behind us. So we go on through. Let's just see if there's anything else. That's quite a nice scene. Bit of a jagged shadow, nice sort of abstract kind of shape across the road there. Again, we've got a vehicle for scale and extra bit of interest. Some diagonal shadows as well. Go on a bit further. Bend around to the right. I'll stop this in a minute and we'll go back to the my chosen painting scene as to see if there's anything else. Yeah, it's got some nice shadows underneath the eaves of the roof. Again, bit of a sort of wavy edge to those shadows as well. Quite nice. And a few diagonal shadows coming from some objects. On the wall there's something protruding from this building. So I'm just looking at the scene, and very quickly in a few seconds trying to think of the main shapes, but don't overdo it, because the more you look into the scene, the more you're going to get bogged down in the detail. Nice to see those triangular shapes to these shadows. Again, that's almost a triangle there. In that sort of on those garage doors there. Let's go around this bend, and we'll be going out through the village. Yeah, that's the end of the village basically. Let me just go back to my chosen scene, which is going to be around about. It's going to be around about here somewhere. Just about there. So this is the one I'm going to do, because well, as you see, that as we've been through the video, there were about a dozen different scenes which were potentials, and that was just looking in one direction, one orientation. If I could have looked, if my dash cam swiveled, I could have looked to the left, looked to the right. That could have been extra scenes as well. But this is quite nice. Dark shadow on the left hand side, nice angular shadow on this building, the pedestrian crossing as well, background buildings, bit of a shadow in the background, a bit of a contrast between that and the light hitting this building. Very bright wall on this building. Quite a soft edge. Think about edges in a painting. So the dark blue sky and this rooftop, that's quite a soft edge, whereas a hard edge would be here on that shadow against the lighter wall. This edge of this hut here, slight sort of slope to it, that's a hard edge, but that, in my mind, that's soft, this edge here, and we'll use a wetting wet technique to get that effect. So that's the chosen scene. So let's make a start then, and of course we're going to start with our drawing first of all. The paper I'm using here is Saunders Waterford, which is very good watercolor paper, and it's 15 inches by 11 inches, secured with around the edges by some DIY masking tape. And for my initial outline sketch, just to get right the main shapes of the buildings, and I'm going to introduce a figure and a car and so on, I'm using a soft pencil just to give me some quite dark lines. And with this outline sketch, I'm just sort of in some areas pressing quite hard, and other areas pressing quite light, just to give me a sort of not a complete line, so to speak. So I'm just trying to get the main areas right, and generally I start with the left hand side and work my way over to the right hand side. Here's the shadow going across the street, and then the pedestrian crossing. Thinking about perspective here. And so these will be hopefully the whiter areas of the crossing. Then some background buildings. Nothing too detailed, just as I say, defining the main outlines of the main shapes. So up the right hand side, that brightly lit building on the right hand side, and rooftop, which will be one of my soft edges, and then this hut on the right hand side, So look at that corner of the building. I didn't do a complete line there. I missed out a little bit in the middle. Just really because in the photograph, or in the actual image itself, you can't exactly see that corner. So I've just put it in quite lightly there, with some gaps in that line. The mauve car, that purple car on the right hand side, and the figure just getting into it, I'm going to completely ignore that. Instead, I'm going to have a car on the road itself. Now I've put some headlights in there. Might need to change my mind when I come to the actual painting. Of course, we're in France here. We're driving on the right-hand side. So it's just force of habit. Being UK-based, I'm used to a car on that side coming towards me. Now, I've got to figure in, just to add something, maybe a balance to that car on the right-hand side. And it will be partly in the shade, but it's just another thing to have something else that's light, a bit of interest, adding a bit of scale to the composition and the overall picture. So I very often include a figure. It would be to have a street scene without any figures or cars, it would look like Armageddon has just happened, and devoid of people. It just in my mind wouldn't look right. So that's the initial drawing done, and now stage two, the initial wash. So my palette on the right hand side, quite simple, not too many colours. From the top I've got neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, which I'm using now just for the horizon, just to put that across that middle area there. I've gone over the outlines of the buildings, and likewise with the sky, which is a bit of a mixture of cobalt blue and cerulean blue there. So after that yellow ochre, I've got viridian green, then cobalt green. In the middle, I've got cerulean blue, which is quite a common colour I would use for skies. And then cobalt blue, ultramarine blue. We're coming down to about 2/3 of the way down now. Ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, which is like a bright red, light red, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow. Now, so I went over the outline of the buildings, and now I'm trying to cover the whole or a majority of the paper, apart from areas that I want to keep particularly highlighted. And I've got to be a bit careful here that I don't allow this to bleed beyond the area where I'm painting. I don't allow this to bleed beyond the outline of the buildings, because I don't want this to damage the sky. So I've got to be a bit careful, and sometimes make this mix just a little bit thicker, maybe, than the consistency of the sky. If it was more watery, it might travel a little bit more and give me some, with watercolor, some undesirable effects. So, as I say, I'm just trying to cover most of the scene. I've gone over the white of the pedestrian crossing because if I didn't do that, it would just be too bright. Most pedestrian crossings aren't pure white. They're certainly light, but they're not pure white, so they will be quite dirty and damaged over time, and won't be perfect rectangles. So cover the whole of the paper, and carefully painting around some of the areas that I want to maintain as white, or I would go in with a separate wash as at a later stage. So I mentioned that soft edge. The sky is still damp, it's drying. Depending on the humidity of where I am, that will probably dictate the drying speed. But I'm now going in with that rooftop, and we're getting, because I'm painting into this damper paper, we're going to get some soft edges, which hopefully the paint won't travel too much, but it's just going to blend just a tiny bit with the sky to give me the edge I want. Now I'm using a medium-sized mop brush here with very soft hairs, just so that I can be I get some nice effects with the brush going over rough paper. You leave little bits of the paper not painted. It can be quite a nice sort of fresh look to the painting. And where I'm painting now, where I painted that yellow ochre first of all, that's a lot drier. So I'm going to get a slightly harder edge down there in the distance. This is it's sort of a weak light red with a little bit of that blue mix I had there in that middle mixing well. Notice how I'm holding the brush as well. To get more precise control, I'm almost using it like a pen, but when I want to be more looser with my style, then I'll hold the brush further away, and I might be standing up as well, just to maintain that distance away from the painting. So this is a dark area of the painting, the background in the middle there. And having that darker background, I've been able, with the car almost in the middle, I've got a little bit of contrast going on. Some shadows underneath the distant shop blind. And this will, a lot of these colours will dry a lot lighter than you first see. So that's something else with watercolour. You have to compensate for this, the effect of these paints drying a lot lighter, and maybe go in a little bit darker than you think, so it doesn't all end up too light. So this now is the road. That far pedestrian crossing. I'm lightly going over the paper, not pressing down too hard, and holding the brush at a slight angle. So this road mix is a bit of, well, that was ultramarine blue, bit of burnt sienna, to get a sort of grey, bit of yellow ochre there. Just to introduce some different colours into this road. If you look at most roads, they're not strictly speaking grey. You can see lots of other colours appearing within them. Cools, cool blues and warm reds, and very often in bright conditions they'll be reflecting objects around them as well. So I need to try and, it's quite a big area of the picture. I need to make it a little bit more interesting, not have it all one value or one colour. So I'm just continuing on with this mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna over to the right hand side. Now, a little bit of a tricky part here, just following these lines. I don't need to be too precise. As I say, with pedestrian crossings, a lot of the whiter strips, they can be worn and chipped away, and jagged edges and tire marks over them. So I don't want to be too precise, but just roughly following those lines there. So even now it does look, do you see how bright those bands are? Hopefully the road's going to dry a little bit lighter, so it's not too strong, that contrast between the white of those strips and the road. Foreground, quickly do this. Everything's still wet. I can still be going back into parts of the road above, and let's do a little bit of splattering as well. Just pick up you can't see my water pot over to the right, but just picking up a bit of water, a bit of fairly controlled splattering, just so that we're messing it up in a controlled way, and it's not too pretty and precise. Now, a first shadow of this, a main shadow of this right-hand building. I've got a straight top edge, but to make that shadow a little bit more interesting, have a jagged bottom edge to it. Now the roof of the hut, just try and indicate this curved roof a little bit. And there's quite a sort of light band along the corner of that roof. Down the right hand side. This being on the right hand side, I don't want to make too much of a feature of this, so anything on the side of the picture, I don't want to put too much detail into it. Just give the impression of some sort of building there. Quite brief, just a shape filling in that right hand side. So I have the sun in my picture for my composition. I've got the sun coming from the left hand side, so this background building has got a bit of shadow on the right hand side, and then there's a lean-to coming out, A few little verticals as well. Bit of shadow underneath the roofs of that of the distant buildings. Shadow underneath the roof, maybe a few little windows, not too many, and they're just little marks with the brush. Bit darker under the shadow of that canopy going across the, it's some sort of shop down there. Now for the next stage, I'm going to go over to the left hand side of the painting and get in those darker shadows on the left hand side and the shadows going across the road, which will be the darkest area of the painting. Now, because this is a bigger area I want to cover here, I'm going to use a slightly bigger brush, a bigger mop brush. This is a Raphael brush here. It's not one of the largest brushes I've got, but it's quite big. So I'm always trying to think about, with size of brushes, trying to think about the largest brush I can get away with, but yet it's still got a good edge to it, because on some of these edges I do need a hard edge, so I do want to make sure that I can get that effect with that brush. If it's lost its point, or it's lost too many hairs, or it's a little bit too old, it may be a little bit difficult to get those crisp edges. So starting fairly dark at the top, quite cool with those shadows. I'm going a little bit warmer now by adding in some burnt sienna. As I did with the road, I'm mixing up different combinations as I come down, so it's not all one, it's not all the same, a single color. Perhaps doorways or windows down at street level. I quite often use cobalt blue for shadows, or cobalt blue with something else like a burnt sienna or a neutral tint. So up the top there, where I was just mixing then, that's normally an area where I mix very dark colours, because up there that's where my neutral tint is, so it just makes it more convenient to mix things up there. So you can see this is a soft brush with the angle of that brush. Now, if this was a synthetic brush, it would have just sprung back to be all in line. And sometimes you do want you can benefit from these natural hairs. You very often can't do this with a synthetic brush, unless it's a good brand synthetic brush. I know Escoda and Raphael and Princeton, they all do different ranges of synthetic brushes that have got they actually react just like a natural hair. So fairly hard edge on this diagonal shadow, but keep it soft as it's joining that lighter area just to the left of where I'm painting now. And careful around the figure. I'll come back to that later on. Carefully paint around the head and shoulders. So not too, with these shadows, I haven't got too much water on the brush. It's not too wet. I still, if there was too much water on the brush, the paint would come out maybe a little bit too fast, and I wouldn't have as much control. I wouldn't be able to go around and create these edges as well as I could do. So it just takes a bit of practice judging the amount of moisture on your brush. And I'm constantly, with a brush like this, I'm constantly, when I'm mixing and I'm just about to put something on the paper, I might just quickly look at the brush to see I've got that edge still, and just to double check before committing and putting something on the paper, I've got the edge I desire. So we'll be going over some of the left-hand, some of these left-hand white stripes. But this is quite an important element of the composition. This shadow going across the road, and it's almost helping us connect the left-hand side with the right-hand side, which is what that pedestrian crossing is doing. I need something to connect the left to the right. Otherwise, the danger is we end up with a sort of picture of two halves, and it just wouldn't look right. So quite dark here, a little bit thicker inconsistency, and dragging the brush, because there's not too much water on the brush and I've got quite rough paper, we're getting some different effects and bits of the paper showing. So I've just, when I had that dark paint on my brush, I've just gone up into the structure above and just added a bit of dark in there. It's all still quite moist. Now, I've got here a very small synthetic brush with quite a nice point, and I'm just adding in a bit of, sorry, I'm just obscuring what I'm doing there, but just a bit of darkness to the edge to get a hard edge. And because the shadow of the wall is still fairly moist, it's all going to blend in with each other, giving us that excuse me, that sort of soft edge. So I'll just continue on now, adding in a bit of detail, top of the wall there. Could be bits of guttering and masonry. Also, I quite often use my finger just to smudge and help things along. End up with quite dark fingertips at the end of the painting, but just to work things in together, get those soft edges. So I'm drawing putting in the face of the figure with mainly a sort of light red, and face, and then the hands or arms quickly. Bit of shadow now. So I'm trying to get the angle, this light, the light, the top bit of the body, it's sort of mimicking the shadow, that light triangle above in a way, and hopefully I can put it off. Again, use my fingers just to lift off some of the paint or smudge it a bit. You could of course use a damp brush, or maybe a paper towel, just to merge things in together when the paint's still moist. Back with my mid-sized mop brush now, and the car. So windscreen, and back of the car. So this is why I've left, in this case, I've left that car unpainted, just so that I can get a nice windscreen in the back of the car. And now, while that's still moist, mix up something dark, a little bit thicker in consistency to the car itself, and going in with this darker paint, things are beginning to bleed, and even though there's a slight slope on my painting board, it's going to travel upwards, this dark paint into the body of the car, just to give me a soft edge. And then of course with the light coming from the left to right, just continue those shadows over the curb on the right hand side, and just slightly over to the right, and thinking about the length of these shadows as well, trying to keep them all fairly consistent with each other. Now a bit of shadow on this building on the right hand side. So this is very much the right hand edge, and I don't want to put too much colour and detail over on the right, because this area is being hit by the sunlight, and the more detail I put in, the more fussy it's going to look, and I'll lose the effect of bright sunlight going in there. Now back with my small synthetic brush, not too wet, almost fairly dry brush strokes here. Just add in a few windows here and there. Now a few lines and objects on the front of this building, just to help with the perspective and defining the building a little bit. It's suddenly giving it a little bit of form, adding something to the front there and those lines. So it's almost dry there on the left hand side now, so a little bit more difficult to lift things off. I'm trying in vain here just to lift off a little bit of paint, just to expose some of those whiter stripes. I'm failing miserably, so drop that and go off and do something else. It's not too important actually. It's in the dark there, and don't want it to be too bright. So continue on with a few more windows down to the edge of that roof and front of building. There's some sort of fence going up the right-hand side of the road. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'll just indicate that with a few lines and some vertical dry brush marks on that hut just to give it a bit of form. Likewise, some horizontals across the roof there of the hut. I'm just using whatever's in the palette, picking up whatever colours there, not using too much water. Now going across the edge of the roof, I don't want to put too much detail in, and I need to be a bit careful with doing. I would never paint individual tiles on a roof. I've tried it sometimes and it just looks, it's almost like it would be similar to painting every pane of a window or every brick on a wall. It's just too much detail. So you just got to sometimes just give the impression of those lines, just a few general, very faint horizontals or verticals on a roof, just to give just a slight impression of the texture of that rooftop, and some tiling there. Now a bit more darks. These are still dry brush strokes, a few darks there in the background. There's some steps or something leading up to the building. Incidentally, up on my Patreon site, these projects that I set, I do share all the reference materials, so this video might well end up as one of my monthly challenges for my my members up on my Patreon site. So I'll be sharing the actual video footage of my Dashcam, and maybe we can all decide which scene we want to paint as we go through this village. Be interesting to see what different subjects people come up with. Maybe you're into fields and you don't want to touch the village at all. So just quite a useful idea, using a dash cam. They're quite a popular thing, and the model I've got is I bought it a long time ago, and I Oh, it's been superseded by so many different newer models now, but I just want a basic one that I use for, obviously, for security purposes when driving along anyway, but it serves a dual purpose here by giving me some resource for when I know I've gone through a pretty village or a nice bit of scenery. I know that I've got something that I could use as some painting material, because I often dry up with some inspiration for what to paint, unless I don't often get the chance to paint outdoors, and so I have to resort to using images. I would very, very rarely use anything up on Google, any Google images or Flickr or any photograph belonging to somebody else, because I just don't have for me, I don't have that connection with the scene. Whereas if I've actually been to a scene and I've photographed it, or here I've driven through this village, then I've got like a little bit of a connection. I just find it easier to paint. So give it a go if you've got a Dashcam. So now really going in with some darker pigment, and I need to be a bit careful with this figure, not put in too much detail. The lower part of the figure is in the shadows. I don't want to draw much attention to it, and still keep it connected with the shadows, not too separate or isolated or different from the surrounding area. So need to be a bit careful. Some tire marks just helps with leading the eye into the composition. Don't want to overdo it, otherwise it will look like some sort of racing track. Of course the car is going away from us, so I've added in some red lines there. And maybe a back bumper to this car. Just gives it, when you put on front grille detail on the front of a car, or the back bumper there, it just makes it look more like a car. And a bit more definition to some of the lines, not all of them. Few more bits and pieces on the left hand side. And that corner, that sort of corner in there, and if I think it's too dark, I'll just smudge it out again while it's still drying. Now I've got some this violet colour down here, fairly opaque, quite good for shutter colours. French shutter colours is quite a common colour used in France for shutters. That too just helps helps it sort of shout France. That particular type of blue. And I will need to, on the right hand side, I will need to get in that tree as well. If you remember from my image, there was a tree, deciduous tree on the right hand side. Perhaps just a few aerials and a few little tiny verticals. So it's fairly dark. The paint I got here is fairly dark and dry, so I've got the again just a few darker dry brush strokes there on the left hand side. Now this tree, so back with my medium-sized mop brush, and these hairs, I'm just splaying them out, and there's not too much water on the brush. Starting from, I'm actually on top of that masking tape there, so I'm sort of painting from the masking tape onto the picture, and not a complete shape on the right hand side, giving a few gaps where the air's come, where the light's showing through. So back with a smaller brush, maybe just a few twigs and branches coming out from the canopy of that tree. Just a few, not overdo it. And sometimes it's at points like this where you're just thinking of something to do and you're hesitating. These can be times when you know it's good to stop painting and try and avoid the trap of overdoing things. Little doorway maybe over there. But I think I'm glad I've left that right hand side quite light just to give sort of contrasting with the shadows on the left hand side, to give the impression of this bright light coming down from left to right. So definitely nearing the end there. Just notice a bit of red across the top of that shop window. Could be a sign or something like that, and a yellow sign. Maybe this is a post office or something like that. So these signs in France are yellow, and that's about it. So just to summarize then, painting using a Dashcam image, download it from a Dashcam, put it on my PC, then just ran through the footage and just relive that little bit of the journey again, just to pick the right scene. And this is what caught my attention, was a scene of different tonal values and nice shadows coming across the street. We've got background, middle ground, foreground, and helpful pedestrian crossing here, just to help us connect the left hand side with the right hand side. And then trying to change the scene just to suit the composition a little bit. I did away with that red car there and that figure getting into the car. So instead I had the figure on the left hand side, giving a bit of balance to the overall scene, and trying to mimic or replicate the angles of these shadows. So that angle there and this angle here, so that can be sort of repeated in a few areas of the picture as well. Also, I tried to get that soft edge of this roof compared to the sky. So with that wet in wet technique, so I went in with the sky first of all, going over the outline of the buildings, and then going in with a darker red color, thicker consistency, so it doesn't bleed too much into the sky. And then a lot of detail work with a smaller brush, just picking up a few details, not too many, not trying to overdo it and overwork it, still trying to keep it nice and fresh. So hopefully you've benefited from that. If you've got a Dashcam, give it a go. I have done several other videos on using photographs for subjects of your painting, so you might like to take a look at those. And certainly have a look up on my Patreon site if you want to consider joining my little merry band of watercolor painters. And we do these monthly projects every month, and you get a little video critique back from me with hopefully some helpful hints and tips. So hopefully you like that, and catch up with you on the next video. Thanks very much.